You know, most of the time when you're doing public speaking, it's important that you have some kind of attention-getting introduction. But in this particular case, I don't think I really need to spend much time on an introduction, simply because of the title of this message, The National Debt and the Collapse of the Nation. We have already finished 4 sessions in this 6-part series. We've been doing those on Sunday evenings. And we've talked about all kinds of different things, and today is the 5th part, and next Sunday will be the 6th and final part of this series. And it's based on a new book that I have coming out very soon called Collapse: Socialism, Capitalism, and the Future of American Prosperity. And the book is really about the direction of the nation, where it's going to end, and what we need to be doing as God's people to prepare for that eventual potential end. We've talked about how free markets lead to freedom and abundance, but socialist economies lead to oppression and poverty. We've talked about the fact that the rich are not always evil and the poor are not always good. We've talked about how profit is the foundation of an efficient economy and forms the basis of our prosperity. Profit is not bad. We've talked about price controls and living wages and all the free stuff the government's giving away, how that costs us jobs, that leads to higher prices and puts us further into debt. We've also talked about stimulus plans and how they don't work. That was our last session, that they don't actually work. They pile up more and more debt, and they give the government more power. So what we're going to do in this session is we're going to bring together all these various strings into a single final point that could lead to the destruction of the greatest nation the world has ever seen. And that issue, that point, is debt. You see, there likely will be no enemy that takes our soil from us. There will be no economy that overpowers us. We will bring ourselves down by debt. So that is what we want to talk about today: the national debt and the collapse of the nation. So we'll do 2 things. We're in chapters 9 and chapter 10 of the book. First, we'll talk about the time bomb that is the national debt. The time bomb that is the national debt. We'll review the debt. I'll give you some numbers, I'll give you some specifics, and talk to you about where all this is headed. I'll even lay out a plan for us to get out of debt and why I think we probably will not do that. And then we're going to talk about the collapse of the federal government. If we don't do something about this debt, I'm going to lay out to you what's likely to happen. Now, I have not received any divine revelation from God on this point. He has not shown up to me in any dream or vision and said, "Wes, this is what's going to happen here in the future." This is actually simple math when you get down to it. Once you understand what the situation is, and then you do the math, it becomes obvious where we are headed. So, let us begin then with the time bomb that is the national debt. Today's teaching, really all that we're going to be talking about this entire session, and I appreciate the music team and Pastor James giving me extra time today. We cut the music short so that we could talk about all this stuff and get a little bit more time. But everything that we're going to talk about is really going to come out of one simple principle from the Bible. And that comes from Proverbs 22:7, which says, "The borrower is servant or slave to the lender." And that reveals what I call the law of debt, that virtually everyone in the nation has forgotten all about. The law of debt is that you cannot borrow forever. It is a universal law. It is as much a law as gravity is a law. You cannot keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. The law of debt says that if you keep doing that, if you do not manage your debts, at some point they will just become your master and they will eventually destroy you. Now, that is what the Creator has said about debt. I think that's worth listening to, don't you? So everything that we lay out here is really just coming out of this principle of the law of debt and helping us to see how this is applying to our nation right now and to all of us, and where it's going to lead if we don't make a change. So let's talk about some terms and the process of the government borrowing debt. You may have heard of the terms deficit and debt. Well, there's a lot of confusion about what the difference is. A deficit is how much the government goes into the hole each year. So if the government brings in $2 and it spends $3, then $1 is the deficit. You see that? That's every year. Deficits refer to yearly going into the hole. The debt is the summation, the total of all the deficits. So if you go into a hole $1 a year for 10 years, the deficit is $1 a year, but the debt is what? 10. All right, that is the difference. Now, the federal government borrows money differently than you and I borrow money. They don't go to the bank and get loans. They issue what are called bonds. And bonds are essentially something that you buy, anyone can buy, and you pay a price for them. Let's say you buy a bond for $100. The government takes that money and it uses it to do whatever it wants to do, and it pays you interest. It might pay you $2 a year for the life of that bond, and then at the end, it gives you back the $100. That's called principal. So it takes that money. So you buy bonds. These are issued by the Treasury Department. They range from 4 weeks, which are called T-bills or Treasury bills, all the way up to Treasury bonds, which can be 30 years in length. They're issued by the Treasury Department, and what the Treasury Department does is they actually have online auctions. So people from all over the world go and bid on these bonds to buy them, sort of like a big eBay for debt. And they have hundreds of these a year. And if you're wondering why some of you may already have some stimulus money from the stimulus that was passed last week, you say, well, gosh, how did I get that money so quickly? Some of you are going to have it, this week. It's because the Treasury Department has already been going ahead and issuing bonds so they can bring that money in and give it to you. So that is how we get into these debts. That's how we get into those holes. Let's look at the details on the debt. Now, what's fascinating right now is that it's hard to keep up with it because it's going so fast. The numbers that I'm going to give you, I'm going to base all the numbers here and the numbers in the book from December, just December. And it's March. But these numbers are trillions off at this point because of how much money we've been borrowing. Right now, as of December 2020, the total debt of the United States government was $27 trillion. That's $2,700 billion. 27 trillion as of the end of 2020. Now, in the last 10 years, we've accumulated almost half of that just in the last 10 years. This is a table that shows you from 2011 to 2020, 10 years, the deficits in trillions. Remember, that's just how much we're going in the hole every year. The total at the bottom, and then the interest in the far column. Now, I'm not going to go through all those numbers. You can kind of just look at it, and you can see that we've gone $12.3 trillion in debt in the last 10 years. It took us about 200 years to get to 5 or 6 trillion. Okay? And in 1 year, last year, 3.7 trillion in the hole. We'll probably get very close to that again this year. But what I want you to notice here, 12.3 trillion in the last 10 years, and this is interest. This is interest that we have paid, not on this deficit, but on the total amount that we had outstanding at that time. So, for example, in 2011, we went at 1.3 trillion in the hole, but we paid 423 billion in interest on the total debt that we had. So, $423 billion in interest. But what I want you to notice here, and this is going to become very important as we start talking about the math of where we're headed, is that we have almost 5 trillion in interest in the last 10 years. That works out to 40% of all that we've borrowed in the last 10 years has been interest on what we've borrowed. So we're in the unthinkable position of borrowing to pay interest. Over that period of time, in the last 10 years, we've averaged about 3 trillion in income. And in the book and in all this presentation, I'm going to give you round numbers. But we've averaged a little over 3 trillion in income. The government has income. The primary form of income for the government is taxes. The government does make some money on things like tariffs and fees and that kind of thing. but that's a small amount relative to the whole. So most of the government's income is taxes, whether it's individual or corporate income taxes. All right? We've averaged about $3 trillion in income, but we've been spending over $4 trillion. So this is that deficit, that little box right there, that's a $1 trillion roughly that we've gone in the hole. These numbers will become important later. And what's interesting about this $3 trillion, and I didn't plan to tell you this, but I will talk about Social Security here in a moment, is a great deal of that $3 trillion is Social Security taxes that we pay when we get paid, which isn't even income tax. It's supposed to be for future usage. We're going to talk about this in a moment. If you're on Social Security, it's very frightening what we've been doing. Well, let's talk about two debts, and this is where politicians get kind of clever. There's only one debt, but they talk about that debt in two pieces. Let's talk about the two debts that add up to one debt. There's what we call, or what I call, I don't know if anybody else calls it this, internal debt. So what happens is, as the federal government receives, its different departments receives money that is earmarked for something. It will take that money and it will loan it to the Treasury to get a little bit of interest. So it's what the Treasury owes to other departments within the government. For example, Social Security. There's something called the Social Security Trust Fund. And the Social Security Trust Fund is an account where all of the FICA taxes and all the Social Security taxes are supposed to be held so that you can use it down the road. And technically in that account right now, there's about a $3 trillion surplus. In other words, the government has taken in $3 trillion more for Social Security than it's spent out at this point. But what has happened is, in order to make a little bit of money, which isn't a foolish thing to do, the Social Security Trust Fund and the Postal Service Retirement Fund and all of these other internal government funds have bought bonds with that money. So they've loaned it to the Treasury, and the Treasury has spent it all. So there is no actual money in the Social Security Trust Fund today. There are $3 trillion worth of IOUs. That's called internal debt. So when you hear them talk about the surplus in Social Security, it is paper only. If you went into that account today, you would find no money. The money's all gone. As of October 2020, that was about $6 trillion in total. Social Security and other government departments had bought bonds, about 22% of the total debt. And then there's debt held by the public. This is where the government gets tricky. It talks about that is what everybody else borrows. Everybody else buys those bonds. So that would include everybody outside of the government. That would be U.S. organizations, your retirement accounts. If you look in those retirement accounts and it has government bonds, that's money in that debt that's owed. Foreign banks, foreign governments, that's about $21 trillion or 78% of that debt. The problem that we have is, and the reason I make a point out of this, is because politicians, and I didn't realize this until I started doing my research, and this is where it got a little more scary to me. If you go to the White House Budget Office and you look for the graphs that they show on what they're spending a year, they show interest. But guess what? They only show interest on debt held by the public. They do not show any interest here. They've hidden it. You have to go to the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, to find that. And it's about a 40% difference. So they're hiding it and they're not telling us what it really is. But these numbers are so big that it's difficult for us to understand if they're a problem or not. Kind of like when you talk about the size of the universe. You remember when we did that presentation on the size of the universe and we started talking about how long it would take to get to the moon and how long to get to Pluto and all that. At some point, it's so big you lose a reference point. Well, the debt's like that. I mean, how much is 27 trillion? It's astronomical. So I developed something, a way for you to hopefully understand. I'm going to take the government, all of its finances, and I'm going to pull it in and make it an individual. His name is Sammy Spender. It's Uncle Sam's son. He's Sammy Spender. And we're going to look at the government debt, the government income, the government interest payments as if it was one person making $100,000 a year. And then we can start to understand what a problem we have. So let's look at Sammy Spender's financials. Sammy Spender, he makes $100,000 a year. Now remember, this is just in December. All right? But he has $900,000 in debt. His debt-to-income ratio is 900%. It gets worse. He paid $15,000 in interest last year, didn't pay a nickel on principal. So $15,000 of his $100,000 was interest on his credit cards. He borrows an average of $34,000 a year in addition to his income. Every year. He has no savings whatsoever. And last year in March or April, he loaned his friends $106,000. That was the first COVID stimulus. And then in the second COVID stimulus, he loaned his friends another $30,000. And just last week, which again is not in our numbers, he decided to loan them another $67,000. In 10 years, and this is just playing out the numbers, it'll be worse than this because of the spending that's going on now. He will be $1.2 million in debt. He will pay $21,000 a year in interest only, and his debt-to-income ratio will be over 1,200%. Now here's the question, and this is, as I move through the presentation, it may appear that I'm getting more and more extreme, that maybe I'm trying to be sensational, and I've wrestled with that all week. James alluded to it. But if you follow me and you understand each point along the way, you see where this is really headed. What is going to happen to Sammy? It is a miracle he hasn't collapsed already. Isn't that not true? This guy is going to be broke. He's going to lose his home. He's going to lose his cars. He's not going to have any food. He's going to be living in the street. Every single part of this man's life is about to fall apart because of debt. And what did the Bible say? The borrower is the slave of the lender, and there is no slave master that is good except for Jesus Christ. We are His bondservants. He's the only master that's any good. Every other master will destroy you. Now, this is your government today. Now, I'm not trying to be sensational. I'm not trying to make things up and get you scared, but this is where we are right now. Where are we headed? So let me give you a simple plan for repaying the debt. Very simple plan. Four parts. To get us out of the debt, out of the hole, it'd take about 100 to 120 years. You think that's funny, but it's taken us 75 years to get here. All right? And it will get us from the point of being borrowers to that we never have to borrow again. How about that? That's the plan. All right? That's the plan. Quickly. And don't worry about the details. I'm just going to lay it out for you very simply. First of all, balance the budget in the next 10 years. That $3 trillion and $4 trillion, get them even in 10 years. Take 10 years to get your income up and your spending down, because in economics, if you do all that at one time, you'll blow the economy up. All right? Take 10 years to do that. All right? Now we're back to even. In the next 10 years, create a $500 billion, a $500 billion surplus. Reverse it, in other words. Okay? So we take 10 years to get it even. Then we take 10 years to get it where we have some money to pay on our debts. All right? That's easy. And then maintain that $500 billion until the debt's paid off, which will be 70, 80 years, depending on how you do it. All right? You get your spending in line, and then build a savings of 1 year of GDP. In other words, our national economy is about $20 trillion. So keep saving that money until we get $20 trillion in an account somewhere. And I'll manage that account if you want me to. Todd and I will. Can you imagine the tacos we can eat with that? If we do that, You see, well, you think the government, it's too big. No, it's not. It's simple math. Now, getting it done is complicated. I'm not saying that it isn't, but the math is the math. Right? If you were in a hole, that's what you would have to do. Reduce your spending, increase your income until you got your debt paid off. That's what Dave Ramsey would tell you to do. All right. Let me give you the reasons that this won't happen. And this is where you start to see, and we're going to talk about this next week, God's judgment. Because it's an easy thing to figure out how to fix in terms of just the basic math, but I believe God has said no. And I'll tell you more about that next week. Why won't this happen? Because we have mandatory spending programs. In other words, we have laws in place that require us to spend a ton of money. Social Security right now is about $3 trillion in the surplus. But they estimate over the next 75 years that Social Security will cost $15 trillion. Now, we also have Medicaid and Medicare. We also have Obamacare. These are laws. So you have to change the laws in order to change the spending. But we have those already in place. So it's very unlikely that your spending is going to go down. Your spending is going to have to go up. Okay? So that's a problem, isn't it? All right, you say, well, we can fix that, can we? Let's see if we can fix that. Limited revenue potential. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you familiar with her? Yeah. Evil liberal congresswoman. Foolish woman, doesn't know what she's talking about. She promotes a 70% tax on the rich. And one of the worst ideas that floats around is that you can tax people at 70% and get tax revenue up. It doesn't work in free economies. And let me show you why. There's something called the Laffer Curve. And it's not Laffer like ha 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 ha. It's Laffer. All right? Now I'm going to give it, it's really simple. Don't get concerned about a graph. But essentially what has been shown through research is that in a democratic economy where people are free to make choices, as you raise the tax rate, the income the government gets out of that increased tax starts to level off and then go down. Why? Because at some point, if you tax me too much, I'll just stop working. At some point, if you tax me too much, hey, I'm a billionaire. I'll figure out a way to get around it. And don't forget that most Congress people are millionaires. So there are always loopholes. And they're there for them and their buddies. The Laffer curve just shows that. So we have tax revenue here. In other words, how much tax money you can get going up from 0 to up. You like that? That's technical. 0 to up. And then over here on the bottom, you've got the tax rate, like 0 to up. So as you increase the tax rate, you see we start to hit a top and then we start to go down. So the misnomer is that we can just raise taxes and pay off our debt. Won't happen. And AOC has no idea about this. Another thing is, because of socialism, the socialist policies that we're starting to adopt, the economy is going to slow down and shrink anyway. I mean, what happens when you double the minimum wage? You raise prices. And the law of demand says when you raise prices, people buy less. When people buy less, the economy shrinks. It's really very simple, economics. So we can only get so much. That's why I said you got to take 10 years and start to do this slowly, because you can't just tax your way out of it. So we have limited revenue. And then finally, and this is the real stickler, lack of political and social will. What in the world is going on in Washington, D.C.? I mean, it is, our politicians are so childish, their bickering is so extreme, that last November, the Republicans are all for borrowing more money. And now all of a sudden, they're not for borrowing money anymore. Last November, the Democrats were all against borrowing money. And now they're all for borrowing money. We can't get anything done in our Congress. We bicker and fight so much, we kick the can. You heard that old saying? We're kicking the can down the road. And what about our people? Do you think our people are going to go for less spending by the government? You think our people have been promised to get their student loans paid off? You think they're going to go for that? The people want more from the government. They want more free money, more free stuff. So these three things, in my mind, guarantee that the government will not change its spending or borrowing habits until it is too late. We won't do it until we're forced to do it. But the problem is, as I will show you, is these things happen quickly. When this thing blows up, it does it fast. It doesn't take 10 years for it to happen. It's just an overnight kind of thing when this all hits the fan. So what does that mean? Now I'm trying to keep you with me. I showed you Sammy Spender and we concluded this guy's going to destroy himself and it's not going to take that long. And I think we can agree. And we look at the country and the political system and the taxes, we look at all the economic rules and we say, what's going to happen? There's no way we're going to address it. We're not going to address it. You see, these Democrats, these liberals, they think they got control of something valuable. But you know what they got? They just got the helm of a sinking ship. And they don't know it. That's what the numbers show us. We are headed for a collapse. So let's move on now. And let's talk about the collapse of the federal government and the nation. And I added there the nation. Because when the government goes into default, it's going to take all of us with it. And I'll show you why. How will it play out? You know, it doesn't take a financial genius to see that we are headed for a train wreck of historical proportions. And we know that we've got to do something about it, but we have already seen that we're probably not going to do anything about it. And I think everybody who's listening with a fair mind is probably in agreement with me. So let's talk about how this will play out. What's going to happen? The first thing that will happen is the interest rates that we pay on that debt are going to start to go up. That's the first step of the collapse. The interest rates will start to go up. Let me ask you a question. Think about this from the perspective of you as an individual. Think about you, Sammy Spender, trying to get credit. He's got a credit report. What happens when you go from, let's say you're at 800 on the credit report scale to 700 in the rates that you pay and are offered by credit cards and mortgages? They go up, don't they? And if you're dropped again to say 600, what happens? They go up. That's a law, isn't it? I mean, not a law in terms of the Congress passing it, but it's just a financial rule. I mean, all right? Why? Why do they charge you more interest when your credit score goes down? Risk. You're a greater risk. So as our financial condition gets worse, our credit rating will get worse, and we will pay higher interest rates. Did you know in 2011, S&P Global, which is one of the world's largest credit reporting agencies, they rate the credit of governments, not just like individuals, I mean the governments. They dropped our rating from AAA to AA+ in 2011 after all the borrowing from the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. Did you know it's still that way today? There's an article by a guy named Mark Jones. He's reporting on the S&P. S&P Global issued a statement about credit ratings that were going to be changed as a result of COVID and all the borrowing. October 16th of 2020, so just a few months back. The report said, moreover, and I'm quoting from the book here, but it contains the quote from Mark Jones about S&P. Moreover, a recent report suggests that many nations, including the United States, could have their credit ratings reduced even further because they have piled on 15 to 20 points of debt as a percentage of gross domestic product. That means that we've got a lot of debt compared to the size of our economy. Amounts that would normally take 4 or 5 years to accumulate, and locked into higher spending for the next 3 to 5 years. So S&P is coming out and foreshadowing and saying, hey, guess what? The ratings are going to go down again because you're borrowing so much money. So what happens? We went from 800 to 700, we go to 600, and our rates start to trickle up. All right? And this is where we start to see the problem. Let me start to show you the problem here. All right, remember we got that $3 trillion that we've got in income right now. $3 trillion we're taking in taxes. All right? Over the last 10 years, rates have averaged 2.5% on our debt, which is pretty good. Historically good. I'll show you in a moment that as well. Very, very low rates. At that rate, we're paying $675 billion on our interest this year, coming up, this year we're in. That's about 23% of our income. That would be like Sammy making $100,000 and paying $23,000 in interest. That's a problem right there, isn't it? But it gets worse. All right? What happens to that number at the bottom when that interest rate at the top changes? Come on, you mathematicians, what happens? That number is going to go up. So we see credit ratings becoming a problem. Let's take it up 1%. Now we're at we're almost $1 trillion in interest with a 1% increase in rates. Because the debt is so big, a small change in a rate is a monstrous amount of money. That's 32%. He's paying $32,000 in interest now. What if it goes up 2% to 4.5%? 4.5%. Now, some of there's some white hair in here, and I'm getting more white hair every day. Is 4.5% on a mortgage a pretty good rate? You better say it is. It is. In the 90s, my first mortgage was 7 3/4. So 4.5% is great. All right? So that's $1.2 trillion. That's Sammy paying $40,000 in interest. What if inflation kicks up? What's inflation? Inflation is the amount that prices rise over time as things get more expensive. What are we seeing at gas pumps right now? What happens when we get a $15 minimum wage? You think your cost of your tacos is going to go up? I've had some slides in here about inflation. I'm not going to get to them. I'm just going to show you a graph here. This is a graph that shows you the interest rates that we've paid on our debt now. In the first column here, the orange one, is in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. In the 1970s, we averaged almost 10% on our debt. In the 80s, it was about 11. The 90s, it was 7. The 2000s, it was 4.2. Remember what 4.5 does to our 4.5% does to our debt interest problem, and then 2.5. This period right here, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. All right? What happens if inflation kicks up there? And these liberal policymakers don't realize what they're doing. They're causing all the prices to go up. And when they do that, they're causing the interest to go up. And when they do that, they're causing themselves a huge problem. They don't know what they're doing. And in the book of Job, God said, He takes away the wisdom of the chiefs of the people. He takes away the wisdom of the chiefs of the people. Do the chiefs of this people have any wisdom today? Look at this. Do the chiefs, and you know what else he says? He causes them to wander in a dark wilderness. Do you see? This is not all financial. This is spiritual. So what happens if we go back to an average here? What if rates go up to the average of the last 30 years of the 20th century? $2.6 trillion in interest on $3 trillion in income. If you get to 11, you're dead even. Everything you make is interest. Friends, we won't get there. And right now that number is about 10 because we are borrowing $3 trillion more now in total. So, interest rates start to go up. And what does this do? This creates a shortfall in the budget. In other words, the nation wants to spend on national defense. What do we spend on national defense? $800 billion probably. We spend Medicare, Social Security, education, roads and highways, right? So we still want to spend. But as the rates go up, we get into these holes where all of this is going to interest. So all we have is just this shrinking amount of money to spend on Social Security and Medicare and all that. Do you see how this math works? And so we've got these shortfalls. And the government's got to try and make up that money somewhere. So where are they going to make up that money? How do we keep paying for stuff? Another terrible lie that people believe is that you can print money. Now, you can do that, but it is widely understood and historically ironclad that when you do that, you get hyperinflation. Inflation 100% and more. There are situations in the last 100 years where nations have done that, mostly third world, and they had individual notes of bills. A dollar bill, they would have $1.5 trillion bills, and you still couldn't buy a loaf of bread with it. You cannot print money. You'll be dead. So they're not going to be able to do that. So that's, all right, how are we going to make up this? We can't do that. All right? Borrow more money. You're paying $87,000 on $100,000 in interest. Who's going to loan you money? Nobody's going to loan you any money, are they? You see how we're chipping away at this to see where this is headed? Raise taxes and cut spending. We've talked about raising taxes, haven't we? We already know that doesn't work. Well, guess what you do when you cut spending? You shrink the economy. The federal government. This is what Ronald Reagan told us. The old actor. He said, don't let the government get too big. The federal government is 20% of our economy. So if the federal government cuts its spending by 10%, the economy falls 2%. The whole darn economy falls 2%. That's massive. So you can't just raise taxes. It won't work. Spending cuts slow the economy. And this is the third step. That's when the death spiral begins. Because what happens is, no matter what the government does, because the debt is so big, because the interest rates are so, and the interest payments are so big, and it's backed into a corner, and no matter what it does, it gets worse and worse and worse. There is no way out of it. Raising taxes and cutting spending results in even greater shortfall in the government's budget. And this is when the death spiral begins. Because the government can't borrow money to cover its spending needs anymore, and because its debt payments are so high, no matter what it does, things only get worse. This is why God said, don't get into this kind of debt, because it will take you down. It's already happened in history. Greece. You guys remember the Great Recession of 08 and 09? It's kind of scary, wasn't it? Well, look at what happened to Greece here. After joining the Euro area, this is from a textbook actually. Well, from the Tax Foundation, and there's another one from a textbook. After joining the Euro area in 2001, okay, Greece joined the Euro, you know, the whole thing that Britain just left in Brexit. Greece looked fairly successful, with annual real GDP growth that averaged about 4% to 2007. In other words, their economy was growing. 4% growth of an economy is pretty good. So everybody looked at Greece and said, man, you guys are doing great. But they were hiding stuff. But its growth was based too much on fiscal deficit spending. That's spending more than you get, okay? Fiscal is just a word that means government finances. And foreign borrowing. What have we been talking about? We're spending way too much and we're borrowing way too much. Exactly what Greece did. With the recession caused by the global financial and economic crisis, that's the Great Recession, Greece's fiscal deficit and debt rose to high levels. Ding, 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 ding. By April 2010, the Greek government effectively lost access to regular borrowing. You see? They borrowed too much, they spent too much, and then the debtors, the lenders said, we're not going to loan you any more money. And that took away all the money that they were borrowing, so they went into a hole fast. The interest rate at which the Greek government could issue new government bonds rose to prohibitively high levels. In other words, the rates went up, what I just told you. Either the Greek government had to instantly slash government spending and enact a massive tax increase, or it needed an official rescue. Do you remember what happened? Rich nations bailed them out. At some point, the U.S. government will meet the same fate. It will slowly be pushed further and further into a financial corner, having enormous spending obligations like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare, pressuring from the right, shrinking income due to tax increases and spending cuts from the left, and massive debt payments coming up from the rear. Every month that goes by, the situation will worsen. To slow the fall, the government may attempt to negotiate better terms with its creditors, but that will only make borrowing harder and more expensive. It may also implement additional rounds of spending cuts and tax hikes, but that will only increase the budget gap. Once the spiral begins, there is no getting out of it. The only way it ends is in a total default on our debt and a total collapse of the federal government and national economy. You say, well, somebody will come along and rescue us. You know what the United States is like? The United States is like the biggest, strongest, fastest stallion God ever made, with 10 million leeches on it. Everybody's got their grip into. And every time we take a stimulus payment from the government, we become another leech, draining its life out. We are too big for anybody to rescue us. When we go down, everybody else is connected to us, everybody's going down. There won't be any way for anybody to bail us out. There won't be any money left to do it. Everybody will be out for his own good. When is it going to happen? This is from the book. So when will all this take place? There is no way to know for sure. But what history seems to suggest is that when economic failures like this do come, they happen rapidly. Mexico had a similar economic crisis in the 1980s, brought on by overborrowing and high interest rates. You see, I'm not making this up. Dornbush, Fisher, and Starts, this is a textbook I was referring to earlier, explain it this way. In the 1980s, Mexico went through a deep crisis. The country had borrowed too much in world markets, and under the pressure of high interest rates in the early 80s, found it impossible to service or pay its external debt. Borrowing abroad became impossible from one day to the next. And here's the trick. So there's another example. We have Greece, we have Mexico. Before it was all over, the result was 100% inflation, a 50% loss of currency value. In other words, their currency became less valuable, so things became more expensive for them to buy from other countries. A 30% decrease in wages, and a nearly 16% drop in the economy. We only dropped 4.3% in the Great Recession. That's 4 times as bad as the Great Recession in this situation. In commenting on the pace of Mexico's crisis, economist Rudy Dornbush noted, and this has become known as the Dornbush Law, the crisis takes much longer time coming than you think. And then it happens much faster than you would have thought. And that's sort of exactly the Mexican story. It took forever and then it took a night. What does this mean for us? It means we will simply wake up one day and our debt crisis will be all over the news. One day all will be fine. And the next day the dominoes will fall so fast our heads will spin. That's what history tells us. That's what economics tells us. So what happens when that happens? What is life like when the federal government defaults on its loans, the economy tanks, the federal government income shrinks tremendously? It can't pay Social Security, it can't pay this, it can't pay that. What is life like? In the early days of the collapse, when this happens, remember COVID. God has given us a lesson in how crazy people get because they're godless now and they're afraid. In the early days of the collapse, chaos, fueled by fear, will erupt across the country. Massive layoffs will occur, and unemployment applications will skyrocket. Initially, political leaders will promise to carry on as normal. Can you hear Nancy Pelosi saying it now? We're going to keep paying everything. We're going to take care of you. Providing Social Security, unemployment, welfare, and medical benefits as they always have. But as the money dries up, they will not be able to keep those promises. Now, I'm going to pause here. And I'm just going to say it again. I'm not trying to be sensational. I'm not trying to cause you to be afraid. I'm just thinking through what people in our country would do and what would happen if the federal government, which is 20% of our economy, failed. Benefit levels will be slashed across the board, if not completely eliminated. People will struggle to find the food and supplies they require. Provisions on store shelves will quickly disappear, and looting will begin. Unable to buy what they need and unprepared individually for such a crisis, people will steal what they can find from whomever they can find it. Violent clashes will result as citizens defend their homes and businesses from mobs and thieves. Hey, we already saw it in COVID. What do you think is going to happen when the government goes under? After the initial chaos, 6 months to a year after the collapse, new challenges will manifest themselves. Soaring inflation will cause money to be increasingly useless, just like it did in Mexico. Homelessness in tent cities will abound. Food shortages will be severe, and starvation will be a real threat for many. Criminal gangs will grow in strength as cities struggle to provide a sufficient police force to maintain law and order. In a matter of months, America will take on many of the characteristics of a third world country. It is highly unlikely that America will retain its position of dominance in the world following this event. Why do you think people fear us? Todd, tell them why they fear us.
How strong we are.
And how strong are we? That military might. Hey, you mess with us, we'll put 20 aircraft carriers on your shores in a week. But what happens when we don't have any more money to pay the sailors, to fix the ships, and to send them out? In fact, nations ruled by dictators or communist governments may replace democratic countries as the most powerful nations on earth. Why? Because they can force their people to give them money. You can't do that here presently, but China can. During this time, America will be ripe for takeover by foreign powers, either peacefully or by force. If another nation or group of nations promises relief to the American people, America's political leaders, in response to the cries of citizens, may willingly pass over U.S. territory or sovereignty in exchange for assistance. Furthermore, due to the lack of funding, America's military will be greatly weakened and may not be able to repel an advance from a foreign enemy. Such a conflict may result in the first use of nuclear weapons since World War II. The collapse may also lead to a persecution of believers. Satan may be able to successfully convince the new political powers that somehow Christians are responsible for the collapse. Perhaps because they would not allow the prior socialist progressive movements in the country to take full sway. This view will not be in line with truth, of course, and reality, but that may not stop its momentum. Irrational fear and the foolish decisions it creates were shown clearly in the response to the COVID-19 outbreak of 2020. And both the Bible and history are full of examples of the godless twisting reality in order to harm God's people. My friends, do you believe for a moment that the godless Democrat liberals in this country simply just dislike us? They hate us because they hate Christ. And as Obama said, never waste a good catastrophe. If the nation is able to preserve its unity, it is also possible, I will say this, and I took this out of my notes, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's also possible that states will withdraw from the Union. Stronger states will remove themselves from the Union. And those stronger states will be rural states, states with food, with land, and not the states that have all the technology and all the banking. So you may see a shift in the structure of the states. And you know the division that we have right now. When the federal government cannot maintain the unity of the land, there may be a division within the country itself, forming more nations out of the United States than simply one. It is also possible that the government itself may become more totalitarian in an effort to keep the people paying taxes and keep the union together. This could turn us into a totalitarian state. If the nation is able to preserve its unity, resist the influence of foreign nations, and maintain a democratic form of government, however weak it may be, life eventually will settle into a new normal. In 3 to 5 years, the people in government will adjust to the changes forced upon them. The lavish lifestyle most Americans enjoyed before the collapse, however, will not continue. Life following the collapse will take on many of the aspects of Depression-era life from the 1930s. Several generations will live together in single homes. Tent cities will become a staple of the American landscape, and jobs will be in short supply. Widespread poverty will turn many to the immoral trades to which humanity has always clung: prostitution, drugs, gambling, and human trafficking. And though police forces will become more robust as local governments regain their footing, a strengthened criminal underworld will remain for years. When I started to write this book, the goal was simply to help people, Christians, understand socialism, understand why living wages were bad, and understand why profit wasn't terrible, and understand that free markets were best. But when I got to the part where I started studying the debt, and I started looking at the type of people that we have in leadership, and the way the American people are going, it scared me. Because what I realized was, this is God sharpening His sword. Where is God in all of this? That's the question. How will we survive it? And can anything good come from it? That is what we're going to talk about next Sunday. I have to leave you now at the point of uncertainty. I will simply remind you of this. The good word says, in the time of famine, the righteous will prosper. This may be a great blessing for us. And I will talk to you about why God is doing this to the nation next week, and how we can survive and even prosper through it.